Hi, all. It's Kelly. I am checking in for week 3. So just to kind of reiterate, there's going to be new content every week, and then there'll probably also be small assignments each week. So keep that in mind and try to keep up with the class. Basically, the first week, it was more about introducing yourself and telling your story, which was the class assignment, telling your story. And then last week, it was more about the cultural quotient indicator and taking a look at your drive, knowledge, strategy, and action. This week, we're going to move a little bit more into the cultural values. It's, I think, something that's pretty fascinating to take a look at because this is valuable information for really kind of the rest of your life, because the context in which you sort of interact with people is really enhanced by you knowing yourself and maybe being able to tell where they're from and what they're like and what their cultural values are and why that might be causing a little bit of friction or misunderstanding between people. So let's go ahead. We're going to dive into this, and just so you sort of know up front, the assignment for this week is going to be a discussion post where you're going to talk about an experience abroad in which you maybe experience some friction or in identifying something that stood out the most to you in terms of a difference in cultural values. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in, and we're going to take a look at the PowerPoint for this week. All right, so cultural values debrief. Here we go. All right, some things just to kind of get you together first and foremost is to understand that these values, they have them broken into cultural clusters. We know it's dangerous to generalize, but it's also valuable in some ways. Because even though you as an individual may or may not actually align with the generalization of the cultural cluster you're coming from. So for many of you, it's going to be Anglo in terms of your cultural cluster. But at the same time, you can be in an Anglo society, but you and of yourself, because of your family network or the neighborhood you're in, maybe you were raised around people who were more Latin American or were Eastern European in their background. So it's just sort of everybody is an individual, but societies as a whole tend to gravitate in certain ways in terms of their values. Now, when you look at yours, where you test is where the little arrow is underneath. So depending on your background, let's say you're Latin American, so that would insinuate that if somebody had to guess, they'd say you were over here. Oopsie. However, because of who you are as a person, you tested over here, more as part of the Anglo culture that maybe you're part of here in the U.S. So it's not meant to be completely predictive, but understanding that here, especially in the Midwest, where it's very much more of like an Anglo society that you have probably been exposed to the most, whether that's inside or outside your family. So it's a spectrum too. I want to make sure that people know that, and that there is no value or there's no best place to be in terms of the good side and the bad side of all of this. It just is. All right. So your personal values, that's where you are. All right. So a lot of this work, if you really want to do additional reading, David Livermore, who does most of the writing and presenting about the CQI and the Cultural Intelligence Center out there. So if you really want to read more, I have this book. You can borrow it from me if you'd like. But one of the things you should know is that these are loosely based on Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions. And it's writing, it's from a gentleman from the early part of the 1900s, the 20th century, who, the initial research was done mainly on sort of younger to middle-aged white males, but it's been very much diversified ever since. But we would be remiss if we didn't give a shout out to the initial person who wrote about it a lot. You should also know, though, that in culture, like if you are going into this field or become really interested in it, Hofstede is considered the seminal author of this work. All right. So, right. So your personal value versus the norms you encounter are going to be important. So in my case, like if this were me, I tested here but I grew up in an Anglo area. But when I was leading a program in Beijing or in South America, I may have actually experienced a little bit of friction because I'm very sort of middle of the road, individualistic versus collective, and maybe I went to a culture that was very collective, and it was uncomfortable maybe with some of the things I encountered in culture and that sort of thing while I was there. Anything from being on a subway and the cultural difference between people that is allowed, not specifically related to this value, but an overlying principle is, we're all going to squeeze in here together because it's for the good of all if we take up the least amount of space, and space is at a premium here. So that would probably be where this would sort of emanate or show itself in terms of being uncomfortable for me. So, all right, but talking then more specifically about it and going through your the cultural values and helping you understand those. Individualism, this picture is sort of the baby represents as you develop as a person, you're very much all about yourself and whether or not you are hungry, uncomfortable, tired, very basic pieces and parts. But, as an adult, it can mean that you're very independent. It could mean it's not something part of your culture to send money back home, for instance, whereas in a lot of other cultures, specifically Confucius Asian, as named by the cluster, families will live together for 3 and 4 generations in the same home. Same thing in Africa, a lot of Latin American families. It's all about the collective. It's sort of the money you make is not necessarily your own. It's very much shared. The resources you have are not just your own. You very much share them with other people. Whereas in sort of more Germanic Europe, as well as Anglo culture, we make more money so that we can buy a better car, or we make more money so that we're more comfortable in our own retirement, for instance. It's the lens in which you do it. It's not good or bad. It's just the way it is, but that gives you a sense of that value. The next one, power distance, is a little bit more complicated of a concept. So power distance, what it shows here is this is more hierarchical. So high power distance means that there's somebody, runs like a university setting. There's a president at the top, and then actually under him there's a provost, and then like the president of the hospital, and then under them there's vice provost, and then under the vice provost, there are college deans, and then under college deans, there are associate deans and then assistant deans, and then under them, there are department chairs, and then under department chairs, there are faculty who have a rank of either professor, associate professor, or assistant professor, and then there are staff members, and so that is sort of a high power distance. Somebody at the bottom of the totem pole is very far from the person at the top. Lower power distance is going to be something that's a little bit more flatter. So it's sort of, there might be one leader who's pushing things out, but that leader is not necessarily super authoritarian. They might even consider themselves one of the team or something along those lines. But if you urge for sort of more equal power across people, or you're in a culture and society that sort of everybody is sort of considered equal across the board, then that is one that's going to have low power distance. So if you think about clubs you're involved in, the types of things that make you the most comfortable in terms of like knowing who is the leader and then who's the person between you and the leader, your comfort level with those different types of things may indicate for you how you feel about power distance, or that little arrow at the bottom of that one. Okay. Uncertainty avoidance is pretty much, so the fact that it's low uncertainty avoidance, it's, if you replace uncertainty avoidance with risk, actually then those titles would be flopped. So if you're low on avoiding uncertainty, you're probably going to be a high risk taker. So, and this can be for things like bungee jumping. But it can also be things like in terms of like making leaps with your job search process, or switching jobs, taking risks in terms of new relationships and those types of things, where somebody who is high uncertainty avoidant is going to be a low risk taker. And then like as a culture, like you maybe have, you're going to invest in lower risk options, whereas somebody who's low certainty avoidant might actually be like full bore into the stock market. And that's what they're basing their entire economy on, for instance. So hopefully that gives you a sense of that one. So cooperative versus competitive, right? So that one is pretty self-apparent, I think, for most Americans. But so it can get kind of complicated though, because for instance, some people, like if you're a part of a team and that team needs to be competitive, but you know that for that team to be competitive, you have to be cooperative within the team. That's still competitive because there are cultures in which competition, even among teams, is not cool. So in general, then this gets much more down to a baseline of it's a little different than collective versus individual, but there are some overlapping certainties within those two. So, but as a person, you might be cooperative, but part of a competitive culture, and that it could leave you feeling a little bit of friction, or maybe you're competitive and you feel like there's a void there because you're in a community that is very cooperative in nature at that given time. So in the US, we're very competitive, and we have a lot of professional sports, for instance, whereas you go to another culture. I have some friends living, for instance, in Singapore, and they say, oh, so what's on their ESPN? And it is, it's sports from the US, or it's sports, like backgammon, and it's just completely different because competition is not a concept that people buy into there. So sports aren't as big of a deal, for instance. Time orientation. This is a fun one to talk about because, are you someone, and this can change in your life, but this is one of the things that can potentially change a little bit. Are you more interested in the short term? And remember, this is a cultural norm. So, maybe a culture that is looking at the here and now, or maybe just the next couple of years out in general when they start looking at some things, versus a culture that's thinking about the long term, like what is what's going on for the next generation, or what did the ancestors do? That would be the major difference that we're talking about here. And different cultures have different ideas about that, and that's going to influence your personal ideas about what is most important to you as well. So, and as a student, because you are sort of on this 4-year timeline, right now you may be feeling the pressure of being short-term, but at the core of things, you're probably a little bit more differentiated than that. It's just sort of the circumstances that you're around that make you think a little bit more short term on a daily basis. But if you're already thinking though, like how is this course or how is this degree going to influence what my life is like when I am 50 or 60, you might be long term. All right. So, all right, context. So if you are a low context person, you're very direct. So there's a low amount of people, like things going on around. So maybe you're someone who writes emails like in bullet point, or you're just very much like, okay, so this needs to be done, like A needs to be done, so we're going to do B, right? And then tomorrow C needs to be done, so we're going to do D. So that's very much low context and working with someone. High context, you may have bullet points to convey, but when I, for instance, write an email to a colleague, for instance, in Brazil, I can't go into it and just provide like a bullet point. Hello, I need to know how much this program is going to cost this year. That would be very rude. So, good morning. How are you today? How is your family? Are your sons well? The weather here in Ohio is very warm. Football season has started. Things are great. Looking forward to sending a group down in January. And in order to make that happen, I need to talk to you about the price of the program. Could you communicate? Like, could you give me a call? Or how about this price? We're willing to negotiate. Help out here. So there's a lot more to it, and that's just required because the world is more complex for people in those natures. It's not a transactional communication. It's more there's a relationship building opportunity with every communication. So that would be a need for high versus low context. All right, so this is one that gets students, especially those who are the type to study abroad and be adventurous and to sort of want to get something done. I would say 90% of students I send abroad are 100% doing, meaning they're doing something, they're moving, they're making things happen, they're writing a paper, they're going shopping, they're planning the next adventure, whereas being is very important in a lot of cultures, and it's just sort of it's not necessarily saying they're meditating, but it's not having things on the agenda. It's when people walk into a meeting, maybe there is a lot of time talking, or it's important just to have unplanned time within that culture. Or people aren't going to show up immediately for a meeting when you maybe thought they were going to. So you have to take a book to read or something along those lines. That is sort of being, and that's very important in some cultures. But just as important as doing is here in the Midwest with highly active college students in the doing segment. So this is where a lot of my students have a lot of friction abroad, is because maybe they did a homestay and the family is just hanging out, and the student's like, we need to be doing something. And but the family in their mind, no, like they're with family, they're getting to know people, they're getting to just be with and of themselves, or something along those lines. So an important concept that we probably have gone a little bit too far in the spectrum here in the U.S. on the doing side, at the detriment of mental health in terms of the being side. So, all right. So this one is a fun one as well. This one, universalism versus particularism. This is mainly about rules. So a universalist believes that there should be one set of rules and it should apply to everyone, and there should be no sort of evaluation or I guess sort of application of the rules in different ways for different people. So it's a very square box, and you fit into that square box. Or if not, you broke the rule. Particularism, it's sort of like there are rules, but we need to evaluate the situation and the way in which we apply them for different people. So in this particular situation, the rule is that, a student has to have a 3.0 in order to be part of the student organization, but this student has fought again and again with their dyslexia or a learning disability. So the fact that they have a 2.9, we should really consider that, and we shouldn't be like an all or nothing sort of on this rule, because this student has overcome many obstacles in order to get to this point, and it's not fair of us to penalize them for something that they were, born with, for instance. So we're going to give them some allowances because they have below a 3.0. That would be a very sort of broad example of that one. Okay. This is literally the fun one. So neutral versus effective. So the person on the left here is very neutral, always a poker face. That's not quite a poker face. She actually looks kind of angry. But certain cultures are much more affective, or they're much more expressive in what they do or how they present things. They aren't as sort of boxed in or trying to sort of behave in a very specific way. They sort of a little bit more free with their emotions and songs and everything else. They're just much more expressive. So when you think about different cultures, for instance, I think of Confucius Asian, and there's great value placed on, the collective. So people are going to be much more sort of wanting to match and blend in with different people, whereas then there are cultures too, like for instance in Africa, and I think about the use of song and the use of drumming and the use of narration and storytelling in that culture, and it is just much more expressive that you maybe wouldn't see in different other types of culture. So, all right. Monochronic and polychronic. Monochronic means that time has one meaning, and that meaning is the clock. I don't have one behind me, but we count things in minutes, and if you don't show up on time, you're late. And there's a work-life balance. Work and life are completely separated, for instance. Whereas polychronic, time can make many meanings. You're multitasking. So it looks like in this picture, this guy is preparing a meal, watching a child, and on a laptop all at the same time. It also looks a little bit like, I guess not, but it looked like his faucet was right over his laptop, and I'm like, oh, that's dangerous. So when I have students, for instance, who are constantly 5 minutes late on the bus for study abroad, I'm like, hey, my polychronic friend, how about you pull it a little bit more toward monochronic tomorrow so that we can get going on time. But it's important to realize that it's in general, it's a value, and it's not something to judge people by, because it is a very much a cultural difference. But I mean, people can be late for all sorts of reasons, not just because of their cultural values, but I think this is a very important one to recognize as well when working with people. So there you go. Those are your cultural values. If you want to read more, there are some different options out there to read. And like I was saying for today, what you're going to be doing is responding on Carmen. I'm going to post a discussion board, and I'm going to ask you to talk about just in one paragraph a time in which you experienced a different cultural value that while abroad that caused you some sort of consternation of some sort. So all right, so that is week 3. Coming up here in a few weeks is going to be your paper topic, like your project topic. So get thinking about that if you haven't come up with a way of synthesizing all of your international experiences together. And then I forget whether it's 3 or 5, it'd be in the syllabus, but you don't have to provide any sort of specific written out information about it, but I forget whether it's 3 or 5 references that would support that topic. So for instance, if you're going to be writing about animal use in zoos across 3 continents, the US, Brazil, and Ireland, because you did Brazil and Ireland programs. What I would want you to do is to, one of your references, for instance, could be maybe an article from the American Zoological Society or Association, AZA. One could be maybe an article about zoos in Brazil, and another one could be about zoos in Ireland, for instance. And then if I did say 5, 2 others in some way, shape, or form. So it really is probably going to be like 1 page, maybe a paragraph where you write up sort of your topic a little bit and explain that, and then have your 3 to 5 references for that. So that's the next big assignment for this class. If you haven't done it already, there is a CQI response paper that is due tomorrow night by midnight. Here, and I'm recording this on Wednesday, so that's due Thursday by midnight. If you need extra time, let me know, and we can negotiate that if you have a good excuse for it. All right, so week 3 over. I'll see you back next week for 4. Talk to you soon.